A quiet afternoon turns tense when Officer Brad confronts a young man outside a coffee shop, suspecting him of wrongdoing for no reason other than his assumptions. But as he pushes further, he's about to uncover a truth that will shake him to his core. What secret is this calm young man hiding, and how will it turn this officer's world upside down? It was a quiet afternoon in the small town of Richmond. The sun shone brightly, and a few people milled about, enjoying the warm weather. Outside a cozy coffee shop on Main Street, Marcus, a young black man in his late 20s, sat sipping his coffee and reading a book. Dressed casually in a gray hoodie and jeans, Marcus looked peaceful, enjoying his break from a busy day. But nearby, Officer Brad was watching. Brad, a tall, muscular man with a square jaw and piercing eyes, was known around town for being strict, and sometimes unfair. He'd been on the force for years, and his sharp gaze often made people uneasy. When he saw Marcus sitting alone, his instincts, shaped by his own prejudices, kicked in. He was immediately suspicious. Brad's brows knitted together as he walked over, his heavy boots thudding against the pavement. People in the coffee shop noticed him approaching Marcus, and a few heads turned. Brad didn't smile or greet Marcus kindly. Instead, he loomed over him, casting a shadow over Marcus and his book. "Hey, you," Brad said, his voice deep and unfriendly. "What are you doing here?" Marcus looked up, meeting Brad's eyes calmly. "I'm just having some coffee, sir," he replied politely, placing his bookmark carefully in his book and setting it down. Brad crossed his arms, not convinced. "What's in the bag?" he demanded, pointing to Marcus's small backpack lying at his feet. Marcus glanced down, surprised by the question. "Just some work stuff," he explained, keeping his voice steady. "A laptop, a notebook, nothing unusual." But Brad wasn't interested in explanations. He narrowed his eyes, suspicion darkening his face. "Do you have an ID on you?" he asked sharply, his tone leaving no room for refusal. Marcus hesitated, caught off guard. He hadn't expected such intense scrutiny over something as simple as sitting and having coffee. "Is there a reason, officer?" Marcus asked, his voice calm but cautious. "I haven't done anything wrong." Brad's face hardened. "You're acting suspicious," he snapped, his gaze never leaving Marcus. "People don't just sit around doing nothing here unless they're up to something. Show me your ID now." Marcus felt a surge of frustration but kept his cool. He knew from experience that arguing wouldn't help, especially with someone like Brad, who seemed determined to find something wrong. "All right," he said quietly, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out his wallet, carefully extracting his ID, and handed it to Brad. Brad snatched it out of Marcus's hand, eyeing the ID as though it would reveal some hidden crime. But there was nothing unusual, just Marcus's name, age, and address. Despite this, Brad's suspicion only grew, feeding off his own biases. "Where are you from, Marcus?" Brad questioned, even though the answer was right in front of him on the ID. "I live here in town, officer," Marcus replied, his tone even. He looked directly at Brad, unafraid, but respectful. But Brad didn't appreciate Marcus' calm demeanor. In fact, it made him angrier. In his mind, Marcus' calmness was defiance, a challenge to his authority. Brad's hand moved to his radio as he glanced around, noticing the people watching from the coffee shop windows. A few of them looked concerned, and one older woman whispered to her friend, casting worried glances at the scene unfolding. Brad felt his control over the situation slipping, and he didn't like it. His grip tightened around Marcus's arm, rougher than necessary. "Stand up," he ordered, his voice icy and firm. "I need to take you in for questioning." Marcus' eyes widened slightly, shocked by the sudden escalation. "Questioning? Officer, I haven't done anything wrong. I'm just sitting here, having coffee," Marcus said, his voice still steady, though a hint of frustration crept in. "Stand up," Brad repeated, yanking at Marcus's arm to force him to his feet. Marcus reluctantly complied, his expression a mix of calm and resignation. Inside, he felt a spark of anger, but he knew he had to stay calm. Reacting would only make things worse. As Brad began to lead him away, people in the coffee shop gasped, a few taking out their phones to record. The scene felt surreal, a young man being taken away for simply sitting and reading a book. Some people whispered to each other, questioning what could have led to this, while others looked at Brad with disapproval, but no one dared to intervene. Marcus could feel the weight of everyone's stares on him as Brad led him towards the police car parked nearby. His heart pounded, but he forced himself to stay composed. He knew he hadn't done anything wrong, but that didn't make the situation any less frightening or unfair. Brad shoved Marcus into the back seat of the police car, ignoring the murmurs and camera phones recording the scene. As he got into the driver's seat, Brad didn't look back at Marcus. He felt confident, even smug, believing he had handled the situation perfectly. As they pulled away, Marcus glanced out the window, catching the eyes of a few people who were watching, concern and sadness on their faces. He could feel their silent support, even if no one had dared to speak up. He took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts, already knowing what he had to do next. In that tense moment, Marcus sat silently, his calm exterior masking a deep resolve. He had dealt with situations like this before, but today felt different. Today, something inside him had shifted. He wasn't just going to accept this treatment. He had a plan, a quiet strength that Brad had no idea about. Officer Brad drove confidently, a smug smile playing on his face. He had just arrested Marcus, a young black man he suspected was up to no good. In Brad's mind, he was in total control, believing he'd shown this troublemaker who was in charge. He didn't look back at Marcus, who sat calmly in the back seat, his hands resting quietly on his lap. Marcus gazed out the window, his expression unreadable, but his mind was working quickly. He knew the time had come to reveal who he truly was. He studied Brad's posture, noticing how the officer seemed relaxed, assuming everything was under his control. Marcus waited, letting the silence stretch, building the tension before he finally spoke. "Officer Brad," Marcus said evenly, his voice calm but carrying an edge. "Do you ever wonder what it means to be fair and just as a police officer?" Brad scoffed, glancing at Marcus in the rearview mirror. "Fair and just?" he repeated mockingly, rolling his eyes. "My job is to keep the streets safe from people who don't belong. You wouldn't understand." Marcus raised an eyebrow, a faint smile on his face. "You're sure about that?" he asked, his tone polite but challenging. Brad frowned, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. Marcus' calm demeanor was unsettling him, though he tried not to show it. "Look, I don't need a lecture from you," Brad muttered. "People like you are always trying to talk your way out of trouble." Marcus chuckled softly, a sound that made Brad glance at him sharply. "People like me," Marcus repeated, his voice still calm. "Officer, have you ever thought that maybe you're the one causing trouble?" Brad's jaw clenched, irritation flashing in his eyes. "Watch it," he warned. "You're already in enough trouble." But Marcus didn't look the slightest bit worried. Instead, he slowly leaned back in his seat, reaching under his shirt. Brad's eyes darted nervously to the mirror, but Marcus moved carefully, pulling out something small and shiny, a badge. A silver badge that caught the light and gleamed with authority. "Officer Brad," Marcus said, holding up the badge so Brad could see it clearly, "I'm an undercover FBI agent. My name is Special Agent Marcus Owens, and I'm here investigating cases just like this one." For a split second, Brad's face was blank, as if his mind couldn't process what Marcus had just said. Then shock flooded his expression, his eyes widening in disbelief. "What?" he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. He looked at Marcus, searching his face for any hint of a joke. But Marcus' expression was serious, calm, and unwavering. Brad's mind raced, trying to piece together what he had just learned. This is some kind of trick," he muttered, shaking his head. "You're lying. You're not FBI." Marcus met Brad's gaze steadily through the mirror, his eyes sharp and focused. "You're welcome to check with your superiors once we get to the station," Marcus replied. "But I assure you, officer, I'm exactly who I say I am." Brad's face turned pale. He swallowed hard, and his hand shook slightly on the steering wheel. "Then, why didn't you just say so?" he stammered, desperately trying to regain control of the situation. He looked over at Marcus, a hint of fear now creeping into his eyes. Marcus tilted his head, a thoughtful look on his face. "I didn't say anything because I wanted to see how far you'd take it," he said calmly. "You see, Officer Brad, I'm working on an investigation that focuses on abuse of power and racial profiling within small-town police departments. And today, you just gave me all the evidence I need." Brad's confidence shattered. His mouth opened, then closed, as he struggled to find something to say. He felt like he was sinking, his authority crumbling under Marcus' calm, unshakable gaze. You were acting suspiciously," Brad stammered, his voice sounding weak even to himself. "I was just doing my job." "Your job?" Marcus repeated softly, his tone cutting through Brad's excuse. "Your job is to protect and serve, Officer Brad. But today, you made assumptions about me based on nothing but the color of my skin and the fact that I was sitting outside a coffee shop. I didn't do anything wrong, but you decided I was guilty the moment you saw me." Brad clenched his jaw, feeling trapped. "That's not true," he protested weakly, but even he didn't believe his own words. "Oh," Marcus' voice was steady, but there was an edge to it, a quiet anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. "Then tell me, officer, would you have arrested me if I looked different? If I were sitting here in a suit and tie, if I had a different face, would you have treated me the same?" Brad had no answer. He stared straight ahead, his face pale, his hands gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. Marcus' questions pierced through his defenses, exposing the prejudice he had tried to hide, even from himself. He felt exposed, vulnerable, and a trickle of fear ran down his spine. Marcus leaned forward slightly, his voice low but intense. "You think you have all the power, officer, but today you're the one who's going to be answering questions. I'll be reporting this incident to my supervisors, and they'll want to know why a local officer is arresting innocent people for no reason." Brad's heart pounded and sweat beaded on his forehead. "Look, I didn't mean," he stammered, desperate to find a way out. But Marcus' calm, unyielding gaze told him that there was no way to undo what he had done. His confidence had vanished, replaced by a creeping realization of the consequences he might face. As they neared the police station, Brad tried one last time, forcing a weak smile. "Maybe we can work something out," he muttered, glancing at Marcus with a desperate look in his eyes. Marcus shook his head, his expression unwavering. "I'm not interested in any deals, officer. I'm interested in justice. What you did today was wrong, and people deserve to know the truth." Brad's face fell, and he swallowed hard, realizing he was trapped. The power he thought he held had slipped away, leaving him exposed and vulnerable. The car pulled into the police station parking lot, and Brad's heart raced, knowing that his superiors, and perhaps the FBI itself, would be hearing about his actions that day. As the police car pulled into the parking lot of the station, Marcus could see a tall figure standing by the entrance, arms crossed and eyes fixed on the car. It was Special Agent Sarah Collins, a high-ranking FBI official whose serious expression gave away the gravity of the situation. Brad's heart sank at the sight of her. He could feel the walls closing in, and beads of sweat gathered on his forehead. This was no ordinary visitor. She was here because of him. Brad glanced at Marcus in the back seat, his earlier bravado crumbling as he recognized the trouble he was in. He thought about apologizing, trying to explain himself, but the words caught in his throat. He felt trapped, and for the first time, truly helpless. Marcus' calm gaze met Brad's panicked expression. There was no anger in Marcus' eyes, only a quiet resolve. He'd made his point and had nothing more to say. As Brad exited the car, Marcus followed suit, stepping out with quiet dignity. Agent Collins approached them with a look that could freeze water, her eyes briefly flicking over Brad before settling on Marcus. "Agent Owens," she said, nodding to Marcus with respect, her tone formal but warm. "I received your report. I'm here to ensure that this situation is handled appropriately." Brad's face paled as he realized that whatever story he hoped to spin, The FBI was already fully aware of his actions. He opened his mouth to speak, his voice wavering. "Agent Collins, this has all been a misunderstanding." But she silenced him with a single look, her expression unyielding. "Officer Brad," she said, her tone steely, "I'm here because we've received multiple reports of harassment, profiling, and abuse of power against you. Today's incident with Agent Owens is just one more example." Brad's mouth went dry. He looked around, hoping someone might come to his defense. But the other officers in the vicinity kept their distance, watching in silence. They knew Sarah Collins' reputation. She didn't come to small towns unless something serious was going on. "Agent Owens," she asked, turning to Marcus with a nod. "Would you like to explain the circumstances?" Marcus took a breath and with calm precision recounted the events. He spoke clearly, detailing every moment from the coffee shop to the car ride, his voice unwavering as he described Brad's assumptions, aggression, and refusal to listen. He was objective, describing the facts without exaggeration or anger. As Marcus finished, Agent Collins turned her gaze back to Brad, her face unreadable. "Do you have anything to say for yourself, officer?" Brad, realizing he had no real defense, tried to salvage what little he could. "Agent Collins," he stammered, his voice cracking, "I was just doing my job. I thought Agent Owens looked out of place. I didn't know he was FBI. I was just being cautious." Collins raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "So, because Agent Owens didn't fit your expectations, you assumed he was dangerous, without any evidence or reason?" Brad struggled for words, his confidence unraveling. "I was trying to protect the community," he mumbled, but even he didn't believe it anymore. His mind spun, trying to find an excuse that might save him, but he knew his actions spoke louder than any justification he could muster. "You've been in law enforcement for years," Collins said, her tone cold and unforgiving. "You should know by now that protecting the community means treating everyone with fairness and respect, not targeting them based on personal prejudice." She stepped closer, and Brad could feel the weight of her words, each one landing like a hammer. Marcus watched as Brad's defiance faded, replaced by a look of regret and fear. The silence hung heavy between them, and for a moment, Brad dared to look at Marcus, a flicker of shame in his eyes. "Agent Owens," Brad said, his voice barely a whisper, "I'm sorry I didn't know." But Marcus simply shook his head, his face calm but resolute. "This isn't about me," he replied quietly. "It's about what you stand for as an officer. Every day, people trust you to keep them safe, no matter who they are. You let that trust down today." Agent Collins nodded, agreeing with Marcus' words. "Officer Brad, your actions today are unacceptable. The FBI has been investigating similar cases, and yours is now a part of that investigation. There will be consequences." Brad's face turned ashen as the full weight of what she'd said settled on him. Consequences. His career, his reputation. Everything he built was now crumbling because of his own actions. He'd spent years enforcing rules, but now he was the one facing justice. He looked down, defeated, knowing there was no way out of this. His whole life had revolved around power and control, but in that moment, he felt small and helpless. For the first time, he understood what it meant to be vulnerable, to be at someone else's mercy. After a moment, Marcus spoke again, his tone even and firm. "Officer Brad, I'm not here for revenge. I don't want to see anyone suffer. But what I do want is justice, not just for me, but for anyone who's been treated unfairly." Agent Collins placed a reassuring hand on Marcus's shoulder, her eyes softening as she looked at him. "Your courage today has made a difference, Agent Owens. The FBI is committed to making sure that officers who abuse their power are held accountable." She turned back to Brad, her gaze hardening. "Consider this a formal warning. You're under investigation, and you'll be required to cooperate fully. We'll be taking statements from everyone involved today, and any further actions will depend on the findings of our investigation." Brad, feeling completely defeated, nodded silently, his mind racing with the consequences of what he'd done. His future looked bleak, but there was no one to blame but himself. He had been given power, and he had misused it. Now he was facing the reality of his actions, and it was a bitter pill to swallow. As Collins and Marcus turned to leave, Brad watched them go, the weight of his regret sinking deeper with each step they took. He was left standing alone, surrounded by the eyes of his fellow officers, each of them reflecting disappointment and disapproval. For Marcus, there was a quiet sense of satisfaction. He had endured the injustice with grace, and he had shown that strength came from wisdom, not aggression. He hadn't needed to fight or yell. He'd simply stood his ground, revealing the truth through his calm, steady courage.